The good group will work together to escape the island or turn it into a little paradise, while the evil group will self-destruct. Now, the third thought experiment. What will happen if you allow one evil individual to paddle over to Virtue Island? And you gave me a nice little far side, mouth turned into an O. Ooh. A messy, not a no-brainer, because the answer to this question is a messy combination of the straightforward answer to the previous two questions. So I call this exercise simple but profound. What this shows, and of course, this is the quickest way I know to convey what in formal theoretical terms is called multi-level selection theory. So what it shows, though, is the traits associated with goodness can evolve at least when appropriate conditions are met. Okay, so unselfishness is indeed vulnerable to selfishness within groups. Selfishness beats altruism within groups, okay? But it is equally the case, equally fundamental, that a group of individuals behaving in ways that we associate as good will survive and reproduce in purely biological terms better than a group of people who behave in ways that we characterize as evil. And so that means then that rather than posing a threat, rather than this idea that evolution can explain selfishness well and altruism poorly, then it turns out that evolution can explain the full spectrum of behaviors that we associate with good and evil, and provides a useful tool by helping us specify the environmental conditions in which we can cause the behaviors that we value to thrive, basically, to be adaptive. Well, you thought I was talking about people, but I was actually talking about hens. So this is now no longer a thought experiment, but a real experiment by my colleague William Muir, a poultry scientist, where else but Purdue University. And his task was to breed a more productive hen to increase egg productivity. And hens have always lived in groups. They used to live in flocks, and nowadays, I'm sorry to report, they live in cages, 9 to 12 hens in a cage. And in both cases, the experiment begins with many cages of hens. In the first experiment, Muir selected the most productive hen within each cage to breed the next generation of hens. And in the second experiment, he chose the most productive cages and used all the hens in those cages to breed the next generation of hens. And you might think that these experiments are similar, that they might produce the same result, and that the first experiment might work better, because after all, it's individuals that lay eggs. Why not pick the best individuals? Wouldn't that be more direct? But the results told a completely different story. Here is the result of the first experiment after 6 generations. What you see here is 3 hens, not 9, because the other 6 have been murdered. These 3 survivors have plucked each other in their incessant attacks. Egg productivity plummeted over the course of 6 generations, and yet the most productive hen was selected each and every generation. So what happened? What happened was that the most productive hens achieved their productivity by suppressing the productivity of the other hens in the cage. Basically, we had selected the meanest hens in each cage, and after 6 generations, we'd produced a nation of psychopaths. And so this vividly illustrates the first thought experiment, basically. Selfishness beats altruism within groups. If you have a group of socially interacting individuals, the nice ones are not interfering with others, possibly helping others. The nasty ones are taking advantage of that, and so that gives them the relative fitness advantage. That makes them most fit. And that's all evolution ever sees, is who is most fit. Here's the result of the between-group selection experiment after 6 generations. Here we see all 9 hens, fully feathered. They look like they're having a good time as far as I can tell. And egg productivity increased 160% in 6 generations. So I call these your Mr. Rogers chickens. They want to be your neighbor. And so what we're selecting here are traits which enable individuals to thrive and also their neighbors to thrive. So this vividly illustrates the second and third desert island experiments, in which what evolves is based in part And not just what causes individuals to do better than individuals within a single group, but what causes groups to do better than other groups. Well, I gave this talk once, and afterwards a professor ran up to me and she said, "That first experiment describes my department. I have names for those 3 chickens." So what she meant was that her department had adopted a policy that rewarded its members purely for their individual accomplishments. And the result of that process was 3 bastards took over the department and gave a result comparable to the chicken experiment. Well, genetic evolution had not taken place, but something comparable had. And so this illustrates something very important that economists call, game theorists call, the replicator dynamic. And what this means is that any process that causes the most successful behavioral strategy to increase in frequency in the population counts as an evolutionary process. Anything which causes the best strategy to increase, to become more common, counts as an evolutionary process. That might be genetic evolution, but it might be many other processes of imitation, learning, intentional thought, fast-paced processes, basically, still give you the same outcome. And so this vastly expands the domain of evolutionary thinking beyond genetic evolution to explain the outcome of fast-paced human cultural and psychological processes will give you the same result as a process of genetic evolution. So let's use some of these ideas to think about selfishness and unselfishness in human everyday life. What we're saying here is that evolution at the most fundamental level is about the relationship between organisms and their environments. Any biologist, evolutionary science begins with studying animals in relation to their natural environment. And then sometimes we take these animals into the laboratory then to study them in more detail. But we will never understand the properties of organisms unless we understand them in relation to their environment. What that means is that there's an urgent need to study people in relation to their everyday environments. And even though that might sound so straightforward, if you know about psychological research, you know that most of it is not like that. Psychologists are lazy. And so that means they study college students, typically for a half an hour. And so what we'd love to do is to study individuals, measure their individual differences, which we just heard about individual differences, and say, we all know people that are saints, sweeties. We trust our lives to them. And we also know the opposite sort of person who we shouldn't or wouldn't turn our back upon. What would happen? What would it be like if we could follow these individuals around and look at the costs and benefits, the consequences of their behaviors? How would we go about doing that? And luckily, I was able to do that by collaborating with this fellow here, and unless you're Hungarian, has the unpronounceable name of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, very famous psychologist who is best known for that book there, Flow, about peak psychological experience. So if you're doing what you love to do and you're totally lost in it, that is the flow experience. And he's written many other books, studied many other subjects. And Mihaly pioneered something called the experience sampling method. This is how he studies all these subjects. Simplicity itself. The day is divided into 2-hour segments, and people are outfitted with a device that beeps them once at random within each 2-hour segment. And that prompts them to fill out a questionnaire that records their immediate experience. So it asks, where were you? What were you doing? Who were you with? What were you thinking? And then a checklist of psychological and emotional and cognitive states on numerical scales. So how well were you concentrating? Did you feel good about yourself? Did you feel in control of the situation? Were you sad, happy, ashamed, proud, worried, relaxed? On and on. And this is how he knows, for example, when, during their daily round of life, people entered a flow experience. This is how he studied flow, but how you can study many other things. So I teamed up with Mihaly to take some of his big studies, his big databases, and to study them from an evolutionary perspective. because this is very close to a field study in which we can follow people around as they go about their daily round of life. So we began with this study here, a big study that was done to determine how young people can prepare themselves to enter the workforce. And one way that Mihai can do these studies is that he has a very practical focus. Okay, so we got $7 million from the Sloan Foundation to do this study. And then we analyzed it retrospectively to look at individual differences in prosociality and their consequences in everyday life. Now, I'm using the word prosociality instead of altruism now because altruism is a complicated concept. It's a two-dimensional concept. It means doing well, doing nice things for others, but it also has a connotation of self-sacrifice, okay? And prosociality means any attitude or behavior which is other-oriented or society-oriented. It's agnostic as to whether there's a component of self-sacrifice or not. And so based on this study, we found 17 questionnaire items that measures other-oriented behavior, such as how important is helping other people in your community and in your life. That's a straightforwardly other-oriented attitude. And so there's the typical bell-shaped curve of prosociality, at least as self-reported by the students. And then we can do a regression analysis to see what prosociality correlates with. So I'm going to walk you through this here. If you are a highly prosocial individual, you are likely to be a certain gender. What gender do you think that is? What? Is there no one willing to stand up for my sex? Well, you're right. So, there. Now, of course, there's the full spectrum in both males and females. These are broadly overlapping curves, but it is indeed the case that the average female is scores higher on this prosociality scale than the average male. Now, the next three items have to do with your social environments. If you are a highly prosocial individual, you are likely to report that you have more teachers that care, more neighbors that help, and families that avoid hurt feelings. This is very important because what it shows is that statistically, highly prosocial individuals tend to be surrounded by a highly prosocial social environment. The next items show that if you are a highly prosocial individual, you are likely to feel very good about yourself. You're going to have a high feeling of self-worth. Okay, so you'll feel hopeful about the future, energetically pursue goals, and feel like a person of worth. Didn't have to be that way. It could well be like the first chicken experiment in which you'd be persecuted by less prosocial individuals. But at least statistically, that's not the case. The next items have to do with long-range planning. If you are a highly prosocial individual, if you have a wide social horizon, you also tend to have a long temporal horizon. You do your homework after school. You think it's important to have children and to give their own kids opportunities. And you don't think it's important, that's a negative coefficient, to party and get wild. Okay? And discounting the future is huge, a huge individual differences. It's the degree to which you're oriented towards gratifying your desires right now versus long-term planning. And finally, if you are a highly prosocial individual, then religion is likely to influence your decisions, and you're likely to have religious friends. So religion, statistically, is a factor contributing to prosociality. Well, these are all based on one-time questionnaire items. And then in addition, we have this wonderful beeper data. So you never really know what a survey means, but it's something else when you get beeped when you're not expecting it. And then right there, you're asked to report, how are you feeling? If you are a highly prosocial individual, you are likely to report that you're concentrating better, that you're living up to the expectations of others, you're living up to your own expectations, you're more happy, you're more sociable, you're more involved, so on and so forth. A picture of psychological health. And so this is a very optimistic conclusion. How are we going to interpret this from an evolutionary theoretical perspective? What we've shown is that statistically, high pro American public school students tend to be highly successful as individuals. Why? It's because that essential condition is met, is that they are interacting with other high pro individuals.